we've talked about this subject before, and you talk around it, and then you thought you got some good news just because the other day the provincial government decided we're going to make $200 million available to try to make life a little bit easier for people who find themselves in RPAs and seniors' residences, and are finding out that they're being moved because apparently some owners, I think this is probably more often the case, simply say they can't make a go of it financially anymore. Now, as I say that, I also understand that a lot of people will say, well, wait a sec. They see that, they have an opportunity to get rid of their building, turn it into real estate, and make a whole lot more money that way. Maybe that's the case. Can't say I know that is necessarily the case, but I do know, and I had an inkling this was coming a couple of weeks ago, and it's pretty much been now apparently a done deal. The King David residence, which is in Côte St. Luc, the next to fall, it looks like they will be closing. They have mainly people over the age of 85 in that building. And when you read that, oh, don't worry, they're going to find another place for them to live. No, when you're that age and you've lived in that for the last, it's the worst possible scenario you could have. So we wanted to get some insight on this, if there is any, from Matt Del Vecchio. He's the owner of Lianas Senior Transition Support. He also hosts a show here on the CJAD every Sunday afternoon called Life Unrehearsed. Matt, we talked about this situation, 2 weeks ago when we found out about another place closing, and now it's King David, and it seems to be a domino effect here. So $200 million or not, what's going on, and why is this still happening, do you think?
Yeah, this one really hits home, Aaron, and I would say you brought up a good point. I think in the vast majority of cases, owners of RPAs and their employees are hardworking people, really trying to make a go of it, taking care of our loved ones. And in the case of King David, it's a combination of just not being able to keep up with the increased costs and also vacancy. There's about 77 seniors that will be disrupted here and will have to find a new residence. But it has a capacity of 100. And when you're operating at around 75% capacity, you're just not going to survive in this world with all these increased costs going on. So it's a real shame, and 77 seniors looking for residences.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the story you don't want to hear. But I find what I don't understand, Matt, is that we always hear stories about people waiting to get into the residences. And, that's how so many seniors end up languishing in an emergency and such, because they're waiting to be placed. So can you explain to us what's going on here? Why are there vacancies and yet there's other people waiting to get into spots?
Right, and sometimes this gets confusing, Natasha. Where the problem is with waiting lists is to get into a public residence. In fact, this is where the root of the problem is. The waiting list for getting into public residences, and quite frankly, the waiting list just to get home care in your own home, in your own condo, those waiting lists have doubled in the last 4 years. And so RPAs, quite frankly, not many of them would exist if our healthcare system was working. But as a result, RPAs play a crucial role for people where they just, can't make it at home, or they don't want to live at home if they're alone. And so the waiting lists are in public. The challenge with RPAs in the private sector, many of them aren't at full capacity. And King David is a perfect example, only operating at around 75%. So you can get into a place like King David tomorrow. There is no waiting list. But when you're at 75%, you just can't survive.
So, but let me ask the question. I mentioned this when we started. I'm pretty sure I did, right? The minister, Quebec minister responsible for seniors, announces the province is going to devote $200 million over 5 years to provide, and this is the quote, personalized allowance for certain senior homes. I mean, yes, this comes too late for King David. Is this a solution? Is this enough to keep these places from shutting down?
Not nearly enough, but it's a good first step. That they're recognizing 500 RPAs closed in the last 5 years. The majority of them were smaller residences. So this announcement by Minister Sonia Bélanger is a good first start. They're supporting RPAs of 30 units or less that are providing care services like bathing and helping with dressing and medication management. So they will get some subsidies for RPAs, because as their costs are going up, we have to, let's face it, it's not cheap to stay in an RPA. They're expensive, and they can't afford to double their rents. So the government is stepping in to support them. But 30 units or less, that's where a lot of the issues are. It's a good first start, but that wouldn't have helped King David. Jardin Botanique, just 3 weeks ago, we didn't hear about it too much here in the Anglo market, but that was another big one in the East End that closed. That wouldn't have helped them out either.
So, I remember after the Heron scandal, the tragedy, there was a lot of talk about just doing away with private RPAs entirely. So they would all be CHSLDs, all public. Where are we with that? And what is the fundamental difference between what's offered at these places? Is it just a different price point, Matt?
Yeah, so just for clarity, Natasha, what the government is looking at, there's two types of categories. The CHSLDs, these are our long-term care homes. These are our nursing homes. So when we say the government is going to be switching the private to public, we are referring to only CHSLDs. They're not converting private RPAs.
Thank you.
There's 1,400 RPAs right across Quebec, very important. 130,000 people living in RPAs. So those aren't the ones being converted to the public system. So if you look at RPA as being a retirement home and a CHSLD, which is the public system, as more of a nursing home.
So it's maybe an unfair question to ask. What's the solution here? As I said, you have these people who'll be forced out of a home. They have made this their home. They're autonomous, but they're 85 years of age, and I'm sure this is the last thing in the world they want to have to deal with. How do they do this? What's the transition going to be like here?
Well, just to give a real example, I was on the phone with an adult daughter, a daughter of one of those residences that are being transitioned. And this gentleman is relatively young, when I say young, in the 70s, but with cognitive challenges. And could you imagine how disruptive this is for this poor gentleman, where he's got to find a new residence, and he's moving in a couple of weeks. So it is very, very tough. And we have to do whatever we can to be able to support families that can afford RPAs, because the big problem is it is too expensive. Not very many people can afford it. This first step by Sonia Bélanger, by supporting RPAs in care services, is a good first step. There are some tax credits that can go to families, but I think it's a combination of the government having to jump in a little bit more to provide additional financial support so more people can afford RPAs. But Aaron, I would also stress at the heart of the problem is if we can focus in on increased home care, start there. We're one of the worst provinces in the country, but we're one of the worst provinces in all of the OECD countries by GDP as a percentage of capita devoted to home care. There's a lot of money, and not enough, obviously, with RPAs, but a fraction going to home care. If we could support more people at home, that would have a domino effect, and hopefully these closures of the RPAs would be reduced.
And Matt, what's the government said in that regard? Because I know they made a big deal about banging their chest talking about home care. Where are we on that?
This is the scary thing. They're pumping more money than they ever have into home care. They are not keeping up with the aging population. So again, as a percentage of GDP, we're still not even close to the more developed countries, and we still need a lot more financial resources and, quite frankly, less bureaucracy. One of these big reasons for these RPAs closing is because of the increased legislation and all the paperwork and paperasse that they have to do. It's killing them.
Can I just add, we have to run, we're out of time here. I just want to know one thing, and I said this when we started. Let's say you own one of these RPAs. You say, oh, I can't make it. You pointed out King David. They can't run with the percentage of, residents they have now. But at the end of the day, we find out they take that building, sell the real estate, put a condo, an apartment building up. That's up to every individual area they're in, like the zoning or whatever, for them to be able to do that. Does the government control that?
Why wouldn't they do that, really?
Yeah, municipalities, yes, but they are. It's legislating at the provincial as well, okay, and there's a lot more to be done. Here's where I have a real problem. If you got a property management coming in and just we're closing this down right away and we're going to convert it to condos, that's a real problem. That's not happening a lot, but that needs to stop. In the case of King David, and I would say honestly, in the vast majority of these RPAs closing, they really made a run of it. But when you're at 25% capacity, just do the math. $4,000 a month on average. You're 25 residents. There's $100,000 per month of less revenue. That's over $1 million of a year. They try to make a go of it for the last 2-3 years. They just cannot do it financially. And I think that's what many RPAs are facing.
Matt Del Vecchio. Matt, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Very informative.
Thank you.